What happens when a young, desperate maid offers her virginity to a billionaire for $1,000, only for him to turn the offer into an opportunity for her to achieve her dreams? Will she trust a man whose wealth and power seem to offer everything she's ever wanted, but come with the fear of being used? As their bond deepens and both face personal struggles, will the billionaire's motives be as pure as they seem? Or is there more to his offer than meets the eye? Can they both overcome their pasts to build a future together? Or will they crumble under the weight of their differences? Are you curious about where this story goes? Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next powerful twist that's coming up. The night was unusually quiet at Blackwell Manor, an opulent mansion perched on a hill overlooking the city below. Inside, the air was filled with an almost eerie stillness. The only sounds that could be heard were the soft shuffle of footsteps on the marble floors and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Maria, the young maid, moved through the hallways with a quiet purpose. Her uniform, neatly pressed and modest, reflected her position in life, an invisible, tireless worker among the many servants who took care of the lavish estate. The house itself was a monument to Edward Blackwell's immense wealth. Golden chandeliers, floors polished to a mirror finish, and furniture that could belong in a museum. But none of this impressed Maria anymore. After years of working at Blackwell Manor, the beauty of the place had begun to fade in her eyes. It was simply a reminder of the life she would never have. Her job was demanding. She worked from dawn until late into the night, always behind the scenes, always unnoticed. Every morning, she woke up at the crack of dawn, had a quick, unsatisfying breakfast, and then hurried to the mansion to begin her duties. Cleaning the bedrooms, dusting the grand library, washing dishes, and making sure everything was pristine. At first, the work had been a source of pride. It was a job, after all, something to support her family. But now, as the years wore on, the pride had been replaced by frustration. Maria was young, 23, and while she still had dreams, they felt out of reach. Maria's family lived in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, and despite her best efforts, her paycheck was barely enough to cover their expenses. Her father, sick and unable to work, and her younger siblings depended on her. Every night, she lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could keep this up. She wanted more. She dreamed of a life beyond the walls of the mansion, somewhere she could have freedom, somewhere she could escape the constant weight of financial struggle. And that's when it happened. That night, Maria was tidying up the grand dining room after dinner when Edward Blackwell entered, looking as composed as always. Tall, with sharp features and dark eyes, Edward had an air of coldness about him. He was a man who didn't need to make an effort to be noticed. He had power, wealth, and influence, but no one seemed to get close to him. He was always surrounded by people, business associates, acquaintances, even lovers. But the intimacy that should come from real connection was absent. He was a man who lived in a world of luxury, yet he was lonely, isolated, and emotionally distant. Maria had heard whispers among the staff about Edward's distant nature, about how he preferred to keep his personal life behind closed doors. He was a man who ruled his world with precision and control, and no one dared question him. His life was a series of cold, efficient interactions, void of real emotion. Maria knew that firsthand. After all, she had been working for him for over 2 years and had never shared a single conversation with him outside of the most basic pleasantries. But tonight was different. Maria's heart raced as she watched Edward walk toward the grand fireplace, lost in his thoughts. Her mind was in turmoil. She knew that the situation she was about to create would change everything, but she didn't care. She had reached her breaking point. Desperation was a powerful force, and it pushed her to act in a way she never thought possible. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she stood at the edge of the room, waiting for his attention. Edward turned, his dark eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "Yes, Maria?" His voice was deep and smooth, yet devoid of warmth. He had never shown any particular interest in her, and she didn't expect him to now. I need to speak with you," she stammered, her palms sweaty as she fumbled with the edge of her apron. "It's important." Edward raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't used to anyone, least of all a maid, asking for a moment of his time. "Go on," he replied, his tone slightly more interested. Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had practiced what she was about to say in her mind, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt impossible to get out. But she had come this far, she couldn't back down now. Maria paused, glancing at the floor, as if searching for the right words. "I am offering something that might help me out of my situation." Edward tilted his head slightly. "What are you talking about?" She swallowed, gathering every ounce of courage she could muster. "I'm offering you my virginity in exchange for $1,000. The silence in the room was deafening. Edward froze, his mind racing to process what she had just said. At first, he thought he had misheard her. But no, the words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and it was clear that she was serious. He stared at her, unable to comprehend why she would make such an offer. Maria's heart was pounding as she met his gaze. She could feel the tension rising between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She had no idea what he would say, but she couldn't take it back now. This was her only chance to escape, her only chance at freedom. Edward's initial shock began to give way to curiosity. There was a strange boldness in her proposal, and as his mind churned, he began to wonder what could possibly drive a woman like her to make such a desperate offer. His eyes searched her face, looking for some clue, some sign of what she was truly after. "Why would you offer me that?" he finally asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Maria lowered her eyes, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I don't have any other options," she admitted quietly. "My family needs money, and I don't know what else to do." Edward remained silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. The maid's bold proposal had shaken him to his core, leaving him with more questions than answers. Despite his initial disgust, he found himself strangely intrigued by her honesty, by the desperation that seemed to fuel her. He couldn't understand it. Not fully, but for some reason, he couldn't dismiss it either. As the moment stretched on, Maria stood before him, vulnerable and exposed. She had made her offer, and now it was up to him to decide how to respond. Edward Blackwell sat in his expansive, dimly lit study, the weight of the evening's encounter lingering in his mind. The soft hum of the city beyond the windows, coupled with the quiet ticking of an antique clock on the wall, felt distant as he leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed to his temple. The room, with its dark mahogany bookshelves and leather-bound volumes, should have provided the comfort of familiarity. But tonight it felt suffocating. He had spent years building his empire, cultivating wealth and power. But as he stared out at the sprawling city skyline, he felt none of the satisfaction he once imagined he would. The things he had acquired, the cars, the estates, the jets, were nothing more than shiny objects that failed to fill the hollow void inside him. At the age of 35, Edward was a man who had everything but the one thing he craved the most: meaningful human connection. His success had isolated him from real emotions, and the people around him were either sycophants or business partners, never true friends. Now, Maria, the maid, had shattered his carefully constructed world with her offer. He could still hear her words in his mind, the audacity and vulnerability in her voice. "I'm offering you my virginity in exchange for $1,000, the audacity of it, the desperation." And yet, the sincerity in her eyes had left him speechless. At first, he had been disgusted by her proposition. How could a woman of her age, someone who barely knew him, offer herself in such a way? It was vulgar, crude even. But then, the question of why kept gnawing at him. What drove her to this point? What could compel someone so young, so full of potential, to offer her most intimate self for a sum of money? Edward's mind churned as he stared at the view before him, lost in thought. His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, the rhythm a reflection of the conflict within him. On one hand, the idea of possessing something as raw and untamed as Maria's desperation intrigued him. It would be an easy transaction, a quick way to satisfy his curiosity and to gain something he could control. An illusion of power in a world where he had already mastered everything else. But on the other hand, something about the offer unsettled him. He wasn't a fool. He knew what power could do to people. But he never saw himself as the type to use his wealth and influence to exploit others. Maria's offer had triggered something deeper inside him, a reflection of his own loneliness and longing for connection. But there was more to it, something he wasn't ready to admit even to himself. He wasn't just disturbed by the transaction. He was disgusted by the idea of having power over someone in such an intimate and profound way. It felt too far removed from anything he had ever valued. Edward's thoughts shifted, unbidden, to his late mother. She had been the one person in his life who had instilled in him a sense of morality. His mother, a woman of deep faith and unwavering principles, had taught him that money and success could never be the sole measure of a person's worth. She had always reminded him that true strength came from integrity, from doing what was right, even when it was difficult. He hadn't thought about his mother in years, not since she passed away when he was just a teenager. She had been his anchor, the only one who ever showed him unconditional love. It was her death that had pushed him into the cold, calculating businessman he had become, closing off his heart to everything and everyone in pursuit of power. But now, as he sat in the silence of his study, he realized that he had lost sight of the very values she had instilled in him. Maria's offer was a wake-up call. For the first time in years, he had been forced to confront the man he had become. And it wasn't a man he respected. The billionaire in him was conditioned to take what he wanted. But the man his mother had hoped he would be saw the offer as something he could not, in good conscience, accept. Edward closed his eyes, his mind made up. He would not take advantage of Maria. He would not allow himself to become the kind of man who saw people as commodities to be bought and sold. But that didn't mean he had to turn his back on her completely. There had to be a better way to help her, a way that would give her the chance she desperately needed without exploiting her dignity. A plan began to form in his mind, and for the first time that night, a sense of clarity washed over him. The offer had triggered something deeper, something he couldn't ignore, a desire to make a real difference, not just in Maria's life, but in his own. This wasn't about money, power, or control. It was about doing the right thing. He needed to find a way to offer Maria the opportunity to change her circumstances without humiliating her or taking advantage of her vulnerability. Edward stood up from his chair and walked over to his desk, pulling out a pen and a notepad. He scribbled down some ideas, quickly sketching out a plan. It wasn't about money. It was about giving her an opportunity, something sustainable that could help her break free from the cycle of poverty. He would offer her a chance to work with him in his business, provide her with the resources she needed to start a new life. He could offer her an education, a path forward. But there was a catch. He had to do this in a way that didn't make her feel indebted to him. It couldn't be charity. It had to be a genuine opportunity. He knew he had to be careful. This couldn't just be another transaction where he used his wealth to control someone. It had to be something that restored her sense of self-worth, not diminish it. As Edward sat back in his chair, the plan started to take shape. He wasn't sure how Maria would respond, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let her offer define their relationship. This wasn't about buying someone's innocence. It was about offering someone a chance. For the first time in a long while, Edward felt a sense of purpose beyond profit. He was no longer just a billionaire who got what he wanted. He was a man who had to make the right decision, not just for Maria, but for himself as well. Maria sat across from Edward in his expansive study, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the features of her face as she hesitated. She hadn't expected to be here, to be sitting in front of him, away from the hustle and bustle of the mansion where she spent her days cleaning and cooking. Yet, here she was, caught between the reality of her life and a world that seemed so far out of reach. Edward had asked her to sit down, offering her a glass of water, his face still unreadable. But something in his eyes had softened since that evening. After the tense silence that followed her offer, he had, without hesitation, proposed a different path. And now, it seemed as though he genuinely wanted to understand why she had made such an audacious proposition in the first place. Maria, with nothing left to lose, decided it was time to speak her truth. Her voice trembled slightly as she began, the words spilling out slowly, the weight of years of struggle heavy on her chest. I was born in a small village. My parents didn't have much, but they worked hard. My father was a mechanic, and my mother stayed at home to care for us. But life wasn't easy. Maria paused, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I was always the quiet one, the girl who did everything she could to help, to make sure that my family had enough to survive. She stopped for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. Edward, who had been sitting across from her, listened quietly, sensing the depth of her pain. By the time I was 16, my father fell ill. She continued, her voice catching in her throat. It was a sudden thing. He was diagnosed with a chronic illness that left him unable to work. That's when everything changed. My mother, who had always been a strong woman, became fragile too. I had to grow up quickly. I started working part-time jobs, anything I could do to help. But nothing was ever enough. Her eyes lowered, and for a brief moment, Edward thought he saw a tear in her eye, though she quickly wiped it away. I left school at 17, and I came here to the city, hoping for a better chance, she said softly. I found work as a maid. It was the only job I could get, and at first, it seemed like a blessing. But the work never ended. There were days I barely had time to sleep, always running from one task to another. And no matter how much I worked, I couldn't seem to get ahead. Maria's words were raw, her pain spilling out as she revealed the truth she had hidden from the world. Every month, I send money home. It's never enough. My father's condition has only gotten worse, and the bills are piling up. My siblings are still too young to work, and my mother, she's too tired, too worn out to help anymore. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix it. I can't keep living like this. I've tried everything, she said, her voice growing more desperate as she spoke. Edward watched her intently, his initial curiosity turning to empathy. He hadn't realized the full extent of her situation, the depth of the responsibility that had been thrust upon her shoulders at such a young age. Maria paused, trying to steady herself. That's why I made the offer, she continued, her eyes meeting his. I was desperate. I thought, if I could just make enough money, if I could find a way to secure a future for myself and my family, then maybe things could change. I never wanted to sell myself, Mr. Blackwell, but it felt like the only choice left. Edward's heart ached at the vulnerability she displayed. He had never understood the desperation that could drive a person to make such an offer. But now, hearing her story, the picture was becoming clearer. Maria wasn't offering herself for selfish reasons. She wasn't seeking validation or wealth. She was simply trying to survive, to give her family a chance at a life beyond struggle. Her choice, while extreme, came from a place of survival, not exploitation. I've been thinking about it for days, Maria said, her voice breaking slightly. I know it's not right, but I thought that maybe, just maybe, you could help me. I don't know what else to do. Edward sat back in his chair, stunned by the complexity of the situation. His initial discomfort with her offer had morphed into something far more profound. Understanding. The desperation, the sacrifice, the love she had for her family. It was all there, laid bare before him. He hadn't seen her as a person before, just a maid who did her job and kept her distance. But now he realized that Maria was so much more than that. She wasn't a commodity. She wasn't someone to be bought or sold. She was a woman caught in the cruel grip of circumstance, doing whatever she could to survive. Edward's thoughts swirled in his mind. His original plan, his desire to offer her an opportunity to escape her situation, suddenly felt more urgent. Maria's story had affected him deeply, and the anger he had initially felt toward her offer slowly turned to a deep, almost protective instinct. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying on your shoulders," Edward said softly. His voice was gentler now, and his earlier discomfort had been replaced with empathy. "You've been trying to carry the weight of the world, haven't you?" Maria nodded, her eyes downcast. "I don't know how much longer I can do it. I thought I could keep going, but I don't know anymore." The silence between them was thick, filled with the unspoken understanding that had formed between them. Edward had always prided himself on being a man of control. His life had been shaped by business decisions, by the pursuit of wealth and success. But now, sitting across from Maria, he was realizing that there were other, more important things in life than power. There was compassion, and there was humanity. Maria looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty, waiting for a response. Edward paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I think there's a better way forward, Maria," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "And I want to help you find it." The connection between them, once a fleeting moment of mutual curiosity, had deepened into something more, something real. Maria wasn't just a maid anymore, and Edward wasn't just a billionaire. For the first time, they were two people trying to navigate a world that hadn't been kind to either of them, each carrying their own burdens, but now, perhaps, finding a way to share them. The following days were filled with silence and contemplation. Edward's thoughts never strayed far from the conversation he had shared with Maria. Her story haunted him, a constant reminder of the stark contrast between his own life of luxury and her battle for survival. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own privilege, and the more he thought about it, the more his initial impulse to make a transaction with her felt wrong, demeaning. It wasn't enough to simply offer money, to make the problem go away with the flick of a check. No, he realized that what Maria needed wasn't a financial transaction. What she needed was the chance to change her life, truly change it on her own terms. And that was something he could help her with. On the fourth night after their conversation, Edward summoned Maria to his study again. When she arrived, she was greeted not with the harsh, transactional tone he had used before, but with something warmer, more thoughtful. He offered her a seat in front of his desk, pouring both of them a glass of water. There was a palpable shift in the air, an unspoken understanding between them that things were about to change. "I've been thinking about what you said," Edward began, his voice steady but earnest. "And I believe that what you truly need isn't just money. It's an opportunity. A chance to achieve your dreams, to gain some control over your future, instead of living under the constant weight of survival." Maria looked at him with a mix of confusion and hope, her eyes wide as if she wasn't sure whether she could trust him. She had seen the wealth and power he commanded, but now, for the first time, she saw a glimpse of something else in him, a willingness to help without strings attached. She stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I want to offer you something different," Edward said, his voice low and calm. "Instead of paying you for what you offered before, I want to help you get out of your current situation. I know you've been working hard for years, And I believe you deserve more than just surviving. You deserve the chance to thrive." Maria blinked, her brow furrowing in disbelief. Was this some kind of joke? A different offer? She had expected him to simply dismiss her, perhaps even mock her for her desperation. Instead, there was a sincerity in his eyes that made her hesitate. She had spent years working for people who barely noticed her, let alone cared about her well-being. The idea that someone like him, someone who had everything, would offer her something more than money felt surreal. Edward leaned forward slightly, sensing her hesitation. "What I'm offering you is a chance to work with me. Not as a maid, but as a part of my business team. I'll help you get the education and the resources you need to pursue a career, to build something for yourself. You'll have a chance to work in a professional environment, to learn skills that can provide you with long-term financial independence. You'll be able to achieve your dreams without having to sacrifice your dignity." Maria's mouth went dry. The weight of his words settled in slowly, and she found herself at a loss for how to respond. She had never imagined that the offer she had made, one born out of pure desperation, could lead to something like this. A chance to change her life, not through a one-time transaction, but through genuine opportunity. "But why?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "Why would you do this for me?" Edward sighed, his gaze thoughtful. "Because I believe in giving people the opportunity to change their circumstances. I've lived a life where everything has been handed to me on a silver platter. But I've also learned that success isn't just about wealth. It's about integrity, about doing what's right." He paused, his expression softening. "I don't want to be the kind of man who uses people for his own gain. You deserve more than that. You deserve to have the chance to stand on your own feet." Maria was speechless. The offer was beyond anything she had imagined, beyond anything she had dared to dream. A part of her wanted to believe it, but another part of her was wary. She had spent so many years living in a world where offers like this were too good to be true, where people in power only gave out favors for their own benefit. She couldn't help but question his motives. Edward could see the skepticism in her eyes. "I know it's hard to trust someone who's never been in your shoes. But I'm not asking for anything in return, Maria. This isn't about charity. I want you to succeed, and I'm willing to help you get there." Her heart raced as she weighed his words, uncertain whether to take a leap of faith. It was hard to shake the feeling that there was still something she didn't fully understand, some hidden agenda lurking beneath his kindness. Yet, there was something in his eyes, a sincerity, a depth that made her want to trust him, even if she had learned long ago that trusting people came with consequences. As the silence between them stretched on, a subtle shift occurred. The power dynamic that had once been so clear, him as the wealthy businessman, her as the servant, began to blur. Edward wasn't just offering money anymore. He was offering a partnership. He was giving her an opportunity to change her life, to create a future for herself. But as much as Maria wanted to believe in the goodness of his offer, she couldn't ignore the flicker of uncertainty in her chest. Could she really trust him? And for Edward, the situation was equally complicated. As much as he wanted to do the right thing, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. He had tried to remain detached, to see her only as someone in need, but his emotions were growing more complicated by the day. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized that his initial impulse, the one that had driven him to offer her money in exchange for something so intimate, had been influenced by something deeper. He was attracted to her, not just her vulnerability, but her strength, her resilience, and that attraction, as much as he tried to deny it, was beginning to complicate everything. Maria, too, felt it, the shifting dynamic between them, the unspoken tension. There was a growing connection that neither of them could ignore, and it made her uneasy. Could she really accept this offer without it changing everything? Without it changing her relationship with him? As the minutes passed, Edward broke the silence once more, his voice more careful now. "Take your time to think about it, Maria. I'm not asking for an immediate answer. But I want you to know that this offer is genuine. I'm not asking for anything in return, just for you to have a chance." Maria nodded slowly, her mind racing. The power had shifted. No longer was she the desperate woman offering herself for a price. Now she had a real chance. But as she considered it, she felt something else shifting too. Something deeper and more personal. Something she wasn't sure how to navigate. For the first time, both of them were standing at the edge of something they couldn't fully understand. Something that was no longer just about money or status, but about trust, vulnerability, and the possibility of a different future. Maria stood in the small apartment she called home, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone to her ear. Her mother's voice on the other end was filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You're what? You're going to work for him, Maria? This billionaire?" Her mother's words were sharp, a stark contrast to the usual soft tone she used when speaking to her daughter. "You've barely known him, and now you're trusting him with your future? Don't you think this is just another way for him to take advantage of you?" Maria's stomach twisted in knots as she listened to her mother's objections. She had known this conversation was coming, but hearing the disappointment in her voice made it all the more difficult. Her mother, who had always been the voice of caution, was now pleading with her to reconsider. "I'm not doing this for him, Mom," Maria said, her voice faltering as she tried to explain. "I'm doing it for me, for us. I know it's hard to understand, but this is an opportunity, a chance for something better. It's not about him, it's about my future." But her mother wasn't convinced. "Opportunities like this don't come from people like him, Maria. You don't get help from men like that without something in return. You're playing with fire. I don't want you to get burned." Maria's heart ached, but she couldn't bring herself to tell her mother the full truth. Not yet. She couldn't explain how she had been moved by Edward's sincerity, or how his offer wasn't just about money. It wasn't just a handout. It was a lifeline, a chance to escape a life she had been stuck in for so long. But in her mother's eyes, it all looked the same. Another rich man offering something with strings attached. The phone call ended with no resolution. Her mother's pleas continued to echo in her mind as she stood in the apartment, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of the decision was heavier than ever. What had started as an exciting opportunity was now filled with uncertainty and doubt. She could feel her family's disapproval pressing down on her, and it stung. As the days passed, the reactions from her family only grew more intense. Her father, though grateful for her hard work, was silent on the matter, but the tension in the air was palpable. He had always been the one to support her, but now he seemed uncertain, unsure of what her decision meant for the family's future. Her younger siblings, too, were confused, caught in the crossfire of their parents' concerns. The voices of her peers were no kinder. Some of the other maids and staff at Blackwell Manor had heard the rumors about her relationship with Edward, and were quick to offer their unsolicited opinions. "You know he's just using you, right?" one of the older maids had said with a dismissive laugh. "Billionaires like him don't do anything without wanting something in return. He'll break your heart, just like the rest of them." Maria felt isolated, unsure of whom to turn to for support. Her entire world seemed to be crumbling, the foundations of everything she had known being shaken to their core. The relationship she had with Edward, an unexpected bond that had been growing between them, now felt like a fragile thread, one that could snap at any moment under the weight of the expectations from her family and society. The next time she met Edward, the weight of her decision was evident in her eyes. He noticed the shift immediately, sensing the tension that surrounded her, even if she didn't say a word. They sat in the study, the air thick with unspoken words. Edward, having spent most of his life isolated, had learned to keep his emotions hidden behind a wall of professionalism. But in the presence of Maria, that wall seemed to crack. There was something about her resilience, her vulnerability, that stirred something deep inside him. He had never allowed anyone to get close, but with her, it was different. He wanted to be more than just her benefactor. He wanted to be the person who helped her succeed, the person she could trust. As they spoke, Edward's own emotions began to spill out in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told her about his childhood, about the loneliness that had shaped him into the man he had become. He shared how, after his mother's death, he had built a life based on ambition and power, but how it had left him with nothing but empty relationships and hollow victories. "I thought I could fill the emptiness with money, with success," Edward said, his voice quieter than usual. "But all it's done is isolate me further. The more I built, the more I pushed people away. The more I thought I had it all, the more alone I felt." He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I've spent my life thinking that success was the answer, but I've come to realize it doesn't mean anything if you don't have anyone to share it with." Maria listened carefully, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She could see the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. For the first time, she understood that his offer was not just about helping her. It was about him needing someone too. Someone to connect with, someone who might understand the price of ambition. The bond between them deepened that day. As their conversations grew more personal, Maria found herself torn between the world she had known, the family that needed her, and the world Edward was offering her. A world filled with possibility, but fraught with emotional complexity. The pressure from her family continued to mount. Her mother refused to speak to her for days after the initial conversation, and her father's quiet disapproval was a constant weight on her shoulders. They didn't understand her decision, and their objections only made her question herself more. Could she really trust Edward? Was she being naive, falling into a trap laid by a man who saw her as little more than a charity case? Or was this her one chance to build a future for herself? A future that wasn't defined by survival. Edward, too, began to struggle with the growing complexities of their relationship. As their connection deepened, his feelings for her became more complicated. He had originally seen this as an opportunity to help her, but now, he realized, it was about something more, something he hadn't planned for. He was becoming emotionally invested, and he wasn't sure if he could keep that separate from his desire to see her succeed. His feelings for her were no longer just about offering help. They were personal. As Maria and Edward navigated the rocky terrain of their evolving relationship, the tension between their personal and professional lives began to blur. Could Maria trust him fully, or would she always feel like she was at the mercy of his wealth? And could Edward keep his growing attraction to her from clouding his judgment as he tried to offer her a genuine path to independence? The fallout from her decision was only beginning. Maria's choice to trust Edward was being tested on every side. And as the days went on, it became clear that their relationship, both professional and personal, was more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The evening sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the city. Edward Blackwell stood at the window of his penthouse, his thoughts far from the business deals that usually consumed him. The skyline stretched out before him, an image of success that felt increasingly distant. In the quiet of the room, he was alone with his thoughts, his gaze fixed on the streets below. His life had been meticulously planned, a series of calculated steps toward power and wealth. But for the first time, he questioned it all. It had been weeks since he had extended the offer to Maria, weeks since their world had shifted, and yet he couldn't escape the feeling that he had done something important, that could change both of their lives forever. But the more time they spent together, the more complex things had become. Maria had accepted his offer, trusting him with a part of her future that no one else had ever seen. And he, too, had let her in, revealing pieces of himself he had kept hidden for years. The walls he had built around his heart, his fortress of solitude, had crumbled bit by bit, piece by piece, until he no longer recognized the man who had once stood so firmly in control. But he wasn't the only one struggling. Maria's family still didn't understand her decision. Despite the opportunities Edward had given her, the pressure from her family continued to grow. Her mother's disapproval weighed heavily on her, and her father's quiet concern gnawed at her conscience. But Maria had made a decision. She had chosen to trust Edward, to take the path that promised a future, a chance to create something for herself beyond the confines of her past. She had taken charge of her own destiny, something she never thought possible just months before. But as much as she longed for the freedom Edward had offered, the expectations of her family lingered. It was harder than she had anticipated to walk away from everything she knew. Edward wasn't blind to the strain she was under. He could see the unease in her eyes, the tension in her posture every time they spoke about her family. He knew she was facing an inner conflict, torn between the loyalty she felt for her family and the life she was trying to build with him. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of his study, Edward finally spoke what had been weighing on his mind. "Maria," he began, his voice steady, yet full of a sincerity that had become familiar to her. "I want you to know that what I offered you is real. I'm not doing this because I think I'm some kind of savior or because I want something from you. I'm doing this because I believe in you. I believe in your potential, and I want to see you succeed. But I also want you to know that no matter what happens, you're free to walk away whenever you want. I'm not asking you to stay out of obligation, and I'm not going to hold you to something you don't want." Maria's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had always felt the weight of their relationship, the power imbalance between them. But his words were different. There was no pressure, no strings attached. It was simply an offer of support, a genuine commitment to helping her succeed on her own terms. And for the first time in a long while, Maria felt the relief of knowing she wasn't being controlled. She had choices. "I know," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I didn't think I could trust anyone like this before, but I want to believe in what we've built together, Edward. I want to make something of myself, not just because of you, but because of me, because I need to do this for myself." Edward smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You will, Maria. You've already started." In the weeks that followed, both of them made decisions that shaped their futures. Edward, no longer driven solely by his need for success, found himself redirecting his energy into projects that mattered to him beyond just profits. He continued to help Maria with her education, giving her the resources she needed to pursue her goals. But it was no longer about charity. It was about empowerment. He didn't just want her to be independent. He wanted her to thrive on her own terms, something he had never given much thought to before. Maria, in turn, began to reclaim control of her life. She immersed herself in her studies, learning skills that would one day allow her to stand on her own. Slowly, the pressure from her family lessened, though there would always be challenges to overcome. She knew she was no longer defined by the small, confining world she had been born into. She had the chance to change everything, and for the first time, she felt ready. But as much as they tried to move forward, as much as they both worked on their futures, the connection between them had only deepened. Their bond, once purely professional, now had layers of complexity neither of them had anticipated. They had started out on opposite ends of a vast divide. He, the billionaire with everything, and she, the maid with nothing, but they had found common ground, even in their differences. It was a rainy afternoon, when the twist came, an unexpected revelation that would change everything Maria had been working. Late on her studies at Edward's office, when the conversation turned to her family once again. She had just come back from a tense dinner with her parents, where her mother had once again expressed concern about Edward's intentions. Maria's frustration was evident, but before she could speak, Edward stood up from his desk, a look of quiet urgency on his face. "There's something I need to tell you, Maria," he said, his voice low. Maria looked up, her heart racing as she prepared for yet another conversation about their complicated future. But what he said next stunned her. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Edward continued, his eyes focused on her. "The reason I offered you this opportunity, why I wanted to help you, isn't just because I saw potential in you. It's because I've been in your shoes, Maria." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Edward took a deep breath. "When I was younger, before everything I have now, I was in a situation not too different from yours. I didn't grow up rich. My mother, she was everything to me, but we lived in poverty. When she passed, I was left to figure things out on my own. I didn't have a chance until someone took a chance on me, someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's why I can't let you walk this road alone. I know what it's like to struggle to make it out, and I want to be that person for you, just like someone was for me." Maria's mouth went dry as the realization hit her. Edward's life, his motivations, had been shaped by the very struggles she was now facing. They weren't so different after all. In that moment, everything shifted. The power dynamic between them, the complexities of their relationship, no longer felt so unbalanced. They were two people who had both known loss, both known what it was like to fight for a better life. And suddenly, the lines between employer and employee, between the billionaire and the maid, blurred completely. They weren't just two people crossing paths. They were partners in the truest sense, each helping the other heal from the wounds of their past, each finding their way forward together. The story reached its unexpected conclusion, not with grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but with a quiet understanding between two people who had found their way to each other through hardship, trust, and mutual respect. Their relationship was no longer defined by the roles they once played, but by the shared journey of growth, healing, and the realization that, in the end, it wasn't about wealth or status, it was about connection. As they looked out over the city together, the future no longer felt uncertain. It was full of possibility, and they both knew that, whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The twist had redefined their bond, not as one of charity, power, or obligation, but as something much deeper. They had become equals, and together they would build a future neither of them could have imagined alone.